Today, I want to talk about cyber victimization, who gets it and why. To start, when you picture of a victim of a cybercrime, who do you picture? And be honest. Because if you're being honest, which I assume you are while sitting in your room watching this video, there's probably some version of someone who should have known better lurking somewhere in the back of your mind. Someone who clicked the wrong thing, trusted the wrong person, wasn't careful enough. And I'm not judging you because we listen and we don't judge. That framing is everywhere, and you're not alone. It's baked into news coverage of data breaches. Users are warned to change their passwords, which quietly shifts responsibility onto the person who got hit, when I'm just trying to keep the same password that I've been using since I was 16 because my brain can only contain so many facts about crime and science. And it's in those tips to stay safe online lists that are basically a checklist of everything you personally failed to do. And the problem is that framing is wrong, not slightly off, wrong in ways that have real consequences for how victims are treated when they report. And the good news is that cybercrime is not like free candy where everyone gets it. Not everyone is at risk for cybercrime, and not everyone experiences cyber victimization. Cyber victimization is not random. It follows patterns tied to online exposure, our routine behavior, who we spend time with and communicate with, and our structural position. This is consistent with what criminologists have argued for decades using lifestyles or routine activity theory. The basic logic is that victimization is more likely when a motivated offender identifies a suitable target and there's an absence of guardians who are capable to intervene. And when all of those converge in time and place, including in online spaces, cybercrime occurs. But in the online environment, this plays out differently than on a street corner, but the underlying dynamics hold for the most part. People who are more exposed online because they either post a lot across platforms or are vocal in their opinions and tend to tweet a lot can often attract people who have the time and energy to come for you online or in person. And lifestyle exposure theory adds another layer. The patterns of our daily life shape our probability of encountering crime, online just as much as offline. And I want to be clear that I am not in any way blaming victims. This is describing how risk operates. When we want to know why a crime occurs, we use these theories to better understand the victim, the offender, and the place where it is occurring. People are not choosing to have their routines exploited. But if you don't understand the patterns, you can't prevent anything and you can't respond effectively. Ashley Flynn and her colleagues published a study in 2024 using a nationally representative sample of about 5,000 Australian adults. This is one of the most rigorous prevalence studies we have on technology-facilitated abuse. And the headline was interesting. Approximately 1 in 2 Australian adults reported lifetime victimization. So this is not a niche problem for unlucky or careless people. This is a majority experience. And that lines up with what we see with US data as well. According to the Pew Research Center, they found that 41% of US adults have experienced some form of online harassment. But here's the part that matters more. That overall number hasn't really changed since 2017. What has changed is the severity. We see more people are experiencing things like stalking, threats, sustained harassment, and even sexual harassment. Pew estimates about 1 in 4 adults have experienced these more severe forms, and experiences involved multiple types of harassment are increasing as well. So the takeaway is not more people are being harassed. It's the harm is getting more serious, more layered, and harder to escape. Now, when you layer that onto the Flynn findings, because the distribution is also not even, LGBTQ+ individuals, indigenous populations, people with disabilities, and those in lower socioeconomic groups all report higher rates, and not just higher rates, more severe psychological impact. And the effects stack. In other words, the people already carrying the most structural disadvantage are also absorbing the most cyber victimization and experiencing the most severe harm from it. And that's not a coincidence. That is a pattern the field needs to take seriously. So now put those two things together. Cyber victimization is not only widespread, but severe victimization is increasing, and it's concentrated among people already carrying structural disadvantage. That's not random, that's patterned. What we also know that is, in addition to people who never become victims of cybercrime, there are also people who are only victims of cybercrime, people who only perpetrate cybercrime, and people who both offend and experience victimization. The victim-offender overlap exists even with cybercrime. In a study surveying nearly 900 adults about their cybercrime experiences, the study found that about 41% were only victims of cybercrime, about 1 in 5 or 20% were online offenders, and about 17% were both victims and offenders. So additionally, cybercrime victimization was a significant predictor of cybercrime offending, and offending significantly predicted the risk of cyber victimization. Now, before that goes somewhere unhelpful, let's slow that down. It does not mean that someone with a complicated online history deserves a lesser response. What it does mean is that both groups inhabit overlapping risk environments, online spaces where certain behavior is normalized. So think forums where people trade pirated content, not like pirate ships, pirated content, peer-to-peer downloading sites, marketplaces where stolen accounts or data get sold, even smaller private Discord servers where harassment or doxing gets treated like entertainment. So you spend enough time in those spaces, the line between normal behavior and criminal behavior starts to blur a bit. And now you're around people who are already doing risky or harmful things. Risk is also central to routines that increase exposure to motivated offenders. And this is a pattern of behavior that occurs every day. So reusing the same password across multiple sites, constantly downloading files from unknown sources, posting a lot of personal information publicly, regularly engaging with strangers online in high conflict spaces. None of that makes someone careless, but it does increase the number of opportunities for someone else to take advantage of them. And risk is also fostered when people are in relationships with others who engage in risky or harmful behavior. So an ex-partner who still has access to your accounts or knows your passwords, a friend who shares your login information or uses your device, someone in your social circle who scams people, harasses others, trades stolen content, or a gaming or online community where one person starts targeting others and it escalates. You don't have to be doing anything wrong yourself, but proximity matters. If someone around you is engaging in harmful behavior, your risk goes up just by being connected to them. So when we see someone show up as both a victim and an offender, that's not a character issue, it's an environmental issue. Same spaces, same routines, same people. Papa John's. Different outcomes at different times. And the practical implication is don't let the discovery that a victim has a complicated online history reduce how you work with them or the quality of your response. That is a research finding showing that risk occurs in the environments that they're operating in, not a character assessment tool. The victim-offender relationship also varies depending on the type of cybercrime. With crimes like cyberstalking, harassment, image-based abuse, or extortion, in cases commonly involving intimate content, the offender is most commonly someone the victim knows, most commonly a current or former intimate partner, which is different, right? Because when we think about cybercrime, we tend to think of an anonymous operator somewhere in a dark room in a hoodie. In reality, these are mechanisms of domestic violence. So it's still in a dark room, just your ex-boyfriend Scott's mom's basement. People are harmed by people that they already know and trust. And with technology, it's easy to get access into information that could be used to exploit others. So when someone reports cyberstalking or online harassment, we should first focus on the relationship history, not device specifics, not IP address tracing just yet, but who has access to this person's life. And this matters because the harms of cybercrime are real. A lot of people just tend to think that cybercrime is just a financial problem, when in reality, it has the power to destroy people's personal and professional well-being. Consider the former. It positions financial harm as the real harm and psychological harm as a bonus category, and the research doesn't support that hierarchy. In fact, in a 2023 study, cyber fraud victims reported emotional effects at higher rates than traditional fraud victims. The crime that used to be primarily about money has crossed into emotional harm territory so consistently that it's now outpacing the offline version on that measure. And in cases like non-consensual image sharing or like revenge porn, which we don't use that term anymore, we're seeing depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, social withdrawal, impacts on their job, and breakdown of social support from friends and family members, even people in relationships. These are not minor effects. These are life-altering harms. And when you compare cyber victimization to in-person victimization, the psychological impact is about the same. So the idea that online harm is somehow less real because it happens through a screen, that's not what's showing up in the data. The harm is real. The screen it traveled through to get there doesn't make it less serious. So if cybercrime's a problem, why aren't victims just calling the police? Well, lots of reasons. In fact, the best estimates suggest that only about 13% of cybercrime victims report to the police, meaning that 87% of cybercrime victims do not involve the police. Of those who do report, only about 8% result in a criminal complaint. So that's not a data quality problem, that's a structural crisis. And the barriers to reporting are not mysterious. We've heard them before. Cybercrime is hard to report for several reasons. One of the reasons is you have to admit to being negligent at downloading or clicking something you weren't supposed to. For other crimes, cybercrime is a grave invasion of personal privacy. So it's not surprising when cybercrime victims report a lot of shame from having been deceived, especially by someone that they trusted, or having something private shared with people that didn't have consent to see it, including the world. Other barriers to reporting are that people don't think it's serious enough for the police to get involved, or they believe the police aren't equipped to help. They report not knowing where to report. Victims have said they report fear of not being believed or ridiculed because they believe someone on Facebook was offering a free phone, and yes, they gave them their name, email, and phone number, but come on, it was a free iPhone. And in image-based cases, the anticipation of having to show officers their own intimate images while explaining what happened is a documented deterrent. And there's a significant gap between the proportion of people who say they would report and the proportion of people who actually do. The victim doesn't have a victim awareness problem. People know something bad happened. They have an access to trust problem. And fixing it requires changing how systems receive reports, not just encouraging more people to make them. So in sum, when we're talking about who gets victimized, it can be people, places, and things. In other words, it can be people, networks, devices. But for people, it's those whose online routines place them in reach of motivated offenders, which is increasingly everyone. People in relationships with someone who decide to use technology as a weapon, people whose marginalized identities make them more vulnerable and whose harm is more severe, people who were deceived, manipulated, surveilled, or violated by someone who either had their trust or their access. Not naive people, not people who should have known better. People. We treat cybercrime like a personal mistake instead of a structural failure. And think about it, most prevention advice looks like don't click suspicious links, use stronger passwords, be careful what you share. None of that is wrong, but it quietly sends a message that safety is your responsibility alone. And yes, personal responsibility matters. But while I'm trying to remember different passwords, companies continue to design platforms that encourage data sharing, store massive amounts of user data, and build systems that are routinely exploited. So when responsibility is placed on individuals, these companies are avoiding scrutiny, regulatory pressure is reduced, and system design doesn't have to change. So we tell people to be smarter instead of asking why the system keeps making it so easy to become victimized. Users play a role, but in reality, it's those who run the platforms. It's those who run the platforms that continue to allow bad behaviors and actors to flourish who should be blamed. Mark Zuckerberg. We don't need smarter users. We need platforms to stop making it easy to cause harm.